Good afternoon. My name is Simukai Chigudu. I'm a PhD student at the University of Oxford, and I'm here speaking on behalf of Rhodes Must Fall. In 1993, Edward Said, the celebrated Palestinian literary theoretician and professor of comparative literature at Columbia University, gave the Wreath Lectures for the BBC. A quote from this series of talks, entitled Representations of the Intellectual, is enshrined in the student handbook in my department, the Oxford Department of International Development. It is cited on the grounds that it captures the department's philosophy of constant questioning and criticism, which are the foundations of intellectual and indeed political inquiry. It reads as follows. The central fact for me is that the intellectual is endowed with the faculty for representing, embodying, articulating a message, a view, an attitude, a philosophy, or opinion. And this role has an edge to it and cannot be played without a sense of being someone whose place it is to raise embarrassing questions, to confront orthodoxy and dogma rather than to produce them, and to be someone who cannot be easily co-opted by government or corporations and whose raison d'etre is to represent all those people and issues who are routinely forgotten or swept under the rug. Now, in many ways, this is what the debate about Rhodes Must Fall, both in South Africa and in Oxford, is about. Whose history is told and whose is swept under the rug, whose issues matter and whose are routinely forgotten. Born in relation to the Rhodes Must Fall movement at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, RMF in Oxford is both an expression of transnational solidarity and a critique of institutional racism and the politics of exclusion at Oxford. While Oxford is certainly strewn with a range of tributes to the great men of empire, the figure of Rhodes has, at this particular historical moment, brought together diverse moral communities and has opened up an avenue for the articulation of shared grievances against imperialism and its legacies. By now, the story of Cecil John Rhodes must be a familiar one. The British businessman, mining magnate, and Prime Minister of the Cape Colony from 1890 to 1896 was an ardent believer in British imperialism. Rhodes and his British South Africa Company founded the Southern African territory of Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe and Zambia, which the company named after him in 1895. South Africa's Rhodes University is also named after him. Rhodes set up the provisions of the Rhodes Scholarship, which is funded by his estate, and put much effort towards his vision of a Cape to Cairo railway through British territory. Now, let's make no mistake about it. Rhodes's imperialist pursuits were egregiously violent and continued to shape the distribution of resources and ideas about race in contemporary Southern Africa. The motive of the invading force can be encapsulated by a letter written by an administrator, colleague, and friend of Rhodes, a notorious W.A. Jarvis, to his mother when he detailed their plans to invade the area north of the Limpopo River. The last thing to do, he says, is to wipe them all out as far as one can, everything black. I hope the natives will be pretty well exterminated. There are about 5,500 niggers in the district, and our plan of campaign will probably be to proceed against this lot and wipe them out and move towards Bulawayo, wiping out every nigger and every kraal we find. And then you may be sure there will be no quarter and everything black will have to die. The pattern of settler colonialism that prevailed in the region involved the establishment and maintenance of political, economic, and social structures predicated upon racial domination and authoritarian rule. As I'm recording this video in my home country of Zimbabwe, indulge me as I say a few words about our colonial history. In Rhodesia, 8 million disenfranchised blacks eked out a living at subsistence level or below it, while 250,000 whites, barely 3% of the population, enjoyed a privileged existence that included, among other things, the highest per capita number of private swimming pools in the world. Hence the running joke that black people don't swim in Zimbabwe. The white minority owned more than half of the country's available land and virtually all of its business and industry. Education, healthcare, housing were all segregated, with whites enjoying levels equivalent to those in Western Europe or the United States. Blacks were confined by law to black urban townships or barren rural tribal trust lands or the workers' quarters of the white commercial farms, on which the World Bank found more than half of black children were undernourished. There was no minimum wage until 1979 when it was set at $20 per month. Now let us return to Oxford. What does it mean then to celebrate the munificence of the architect of such a system without acknowledging the injustice and suffering meted out to those from whom his wealth was extracted? The Rhodes statue continues to sit proudly above the High Street at Oriel College's front-facing edifice. Over the course of multiple debates at the university, it has been repeatedly stated that Rhodes's actions should not be judged by today's standards, since Rhodes was a product of his time, despite the fact that the peoples of Southern Africa variously opposed Rhodes and colonialism through numerous protests, wars, and insurgencies from the 1890s onwards. Moreover, Rhodes Must Fall has been accused of trying to rewrite, or more ironically, to whitewash history. The newly appointed Vice-Chancellor of the University, Louise Richardson, has made this precise claim, while the Chancellor of the University, Chris Patton, went as far as saying that students who don't like Rhodes should consider being educated elsewhere. His criticisms went further. He charged that agitation to remove the Rhodes statue was tantamount to suppressing free speech and was a form of self-indulgent victimhood that was too afraid to face up to the historical record. Similarly, the celebrated classicist Mary Beard suggested that Rhodes Must Fall students must become empowered enough to face the statue every day without calling for its removal. The principal of Hartford College, Will Hutton, an ostensibly left-wing intellectual, said that if it were not for the legacies of empire, such as constitutionalism, the rule of law, and free speech, as well as freedom of association, then South Africa would descend into unaccountable despotism as embodied by Jacob Zuma. One wonders what history Mr. Hutton has been reading that has led him to think that the apartheid regime entailed the freedom of association. One more comment that captures much of the establishment's common sense comes from Oriel alumnus and Conservative MP Daniel Hennon. He wrote in an op-ed in the Telegraph that Rhodes Must Fall is a cretinous mob made up of politically correct victims who are too dim to be at university. For the writer Teju Cole, such commentary simply represents a white supremacist establishment's hostility towards post-colonial assertions of self. For me, the irony of this exchange is that Oxford's leadership has demonstrated the very Eurocentric thinking that RMF in Oxford has been railing against, both in the popular imagination and in scholarly practice. Far from erasing history, RMF is challenging orthodox historical consciousness about empire in the British imagination. As social scientists, historians and scholars of material culture have long argued, statues are imbued with power and politics and remain subject to contestation and renegotiation. Rhodes Must Fall thus invites us to ask questions about how we memorialize the past and whose narratives we privilege in doing so and why. Indeed, we would do well to ask similar questions about other legacies and statues at the university. These moments are productive and positive ones. They allow us the opportunity to debate the concerns raised by those who have been affected directly by these histories. They allow us to consider the ways in which these legacies continue to affect us all. They allow us to think and force us to consider how best to publicly mark such histories. The idea that the RMF movement is trying to shut down debate or efface history entirely misses the point. It is attacks and threats against individuals in RMF, Tokozo most notably, and it is the facile suggestion that RMF activists are born of a culture of victimhood that has most clearly endangered an open debate about the past and its role in the present. More importantly, RMF is a movement about decolonization, and as such, it is about much more than a statue. The notion of decolonization in this context is a manifold metaphor to mean questioning the hegemony of white Western thought in fields of study as diverse as history, politics, philosophy, modern languages, science, and literature. Far from erasure, this is about free speech in its truest form. It is about pluralizing and complicating the ways in which knowledge is produced, disseminated, and granted legitimacy. Following Edward Said, it seems to me that as scholars we all share an intellectual obligation to push this agenda forward. Lastly, it is crucial to point out that there is extensive documentation from groups such as Oxford's Campaign for Racial Awareness and Equality that Black and other minority ethnic students frequently face both subtle and overt racism at Oxford University and often feel excluded within this space. I personally have encountered such instances and have heard a myriad stories to this effect, especially when I was vice president of the Africa Society. Discussions about race and racism may be new to many at Oxford, but they are a daily reality for a large number of Black and other minority ethnic people within and beyond the university's cloisters. When RMF talks about institutional racism, when it asks for the inclusion of minority voices in the academic curriculum, and when it challenges the celebratory iconography of imperialists, colonialists, racists, and other genocidaires, it is not indulging in victimhood culture. Quite the opposite, it is demanding honor, respect, and recognition.